She had been watching him for 3 weeks before she finally understood what she was looking at. Not a man waiting for a train. Not a man with somewhere to be. A man who had already arrived at the only place he ever intended to go, and was simply refusing to leave it. The Friday he finally spoke to her, the rain came down in sheets. The platform was empty except for the two of them, and Clara Winslow had a decision to make. She could walk back inside, pour herself another cup of bad coffee, and mind her own business the way every sensible person in Redstone Crossing had done for 3 years. Or she could ask the question that had been living in her chest since the first morning she watched him sit down on that bench, hold his hat in both hands, and stare down the empty track like a man staring into the mouth of something he still hadn't made peace with. She asked, and what he told her, quietly, without drama, without self-pity, broke something open inside her that she had spent the better part of a year trying to keep sealed shut. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about real human decisions, real love, real loss, and the moments that change everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The first time Clara Winslow saw Gideon Mercer, she thought he was waiting for someone who was late. That was a reasonable assumption. People waited at train stations. That was the entire purpose of the building she now worked in. A squat, wood-framed structure that smelled permanently of coal smoke, damp wool, and the particular loneliness of departures. Clara had taken the clerk position 2 months earlier, in October, when the leaves along the creek had already turned and the wind coming off the open Kansas plain carried a cold in it that felt personal, like it had been specifically designed to find the gaps in a person's coat. She had come to Redstone Crossing because she had nowhere else to go. That was the truth she hadn't yet told anyone in this town, and she wasn't planning to. People in frontier towns had enough of their own troubles without absorbing a stranger's grief. Her mother had died in March. Her father had followed in August, as though he had only been waiting to make sure she was through the worst of it before he decided to let go himself. After the second funeral, Clara had stood in the empty house in Topeka, their house, the house she'd grown up in, and realized with a quiet kind of horror that she was 31 years old, had no husband, no children, no career to speak of, and had spent the last 6 years of her life in the service of 2 people who no longer needed her. She had loved them. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that loving them had become her entire identity, and now the identity was gone. And what was left was just Clara, unfamiliar Clara, purposeless Clara, standing in a house full of furniture that suddenly had nothing to do with her. The job posting had come through a cousin's connection. Station clerk, Redstone Crossing, Kansas. Immediate start. Room included. The salary was modest but livable, and the distance from Topeka was exactly what she needed. Not so far that it felt like running, just far enough to feel like a choice. She had arrived on a Wednesday. By the following Friday, she was behind the ticket window when the man walked in. He wasn't what she expected from a cattle rancher, and she knew immediately that was what he was. The boots told you, and the particular set of his shoulders, the kind of posture that came from spending years doing physical work outdoors rather than leaning over a desk. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. Not disheveled, just a man who had more important things to attend to than the mirror. He walked directly to the window and said, without looking up, "1 platform ticket." Clara sold it to him. He paid without fumbling, pocketed the change with the efficiency of a man who had made this exact transaction many times before, and walked out through the side door onto the platform. She watched through the window. He sat on the bench at the far end, the third bench, the one closest to the point where the eastbound track curved away toward the horizon. He set his hat on his knee. He looked at the track, and he sat. The 11:40 from Salina arrived 14 minutes late that Friday, which was almost punctual by its standards. 12 passengers disembarked. Clara could see Gideon's profile from the window as each one came through the gate, a slight tension in his body, the way a man's posture changes when he's scanning a crowd, and then a settling, a kind of slow exhale. As each passenger passed him and went on their way into town, she watched him recede back into stillness. When the platform was empty and the train had gone, he stood, put his hat back on his head, and walked to the stable behind the building where he'd left his horse. 5 minutes later, he was gone. The following Friday, he was back. Same time, same window. One platform ticket, exact change, same bench, same stillness, same slow, careful study of every face coming off the eastbound train, followed by that quiet, particular settling into whatever he carried home with him. By the third Friday, Clara had begun leaving the window unlocked during the 11:40 arrival specifically so she could watch him without it looking deliberate. She told herself it was professional vigilance. She was responsible for the platform. She should know who was on it. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. What she was actually doing was watching a man grieve and recognizing it the way you only recognize something when you've been doing it yourself. She didn't approach him that third Friday, or the fourth. What stopped her wasn't shyness. Clara had never been especially shy. What stopped her was the feeling that whatever was happening on that bench was private in a way that public spaces rarely contained, and that walking over and introducing herself would be like opening a door she hadn't been invited to open. But it bothered her. It sat in the back of her mind on Thursday evenings and made the Friday mornings feel weighted with a significance she couldn't quite name. She asked Ruth Alcott, who worked in the telegraph office and knew everything about everyone in Redstone, crossing the way certain women in small towns simply do. Gideon Mercer, Ruth said without needing any further description. She knew immediately who Clara meant. Comes every Friday. Has done for, 3 years at least. Maybe closer to 3.5 now. Does he have family coming in? Someone he's waiting on? Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she looked away, out through the telegraph office window, in the direction of nothing in particular. His wife used to come back on that train, she said finally. Lillian. She'd go stay with her mother and Selena when the old woman took sick, which was often toward the end. Every Friday she'd come back on the 11:40. Gideon would be there waiting. Clara waited. Lillian passed, Ruth said. Fever. Going on 4 years ago now. And Gideon kept coming. She paused. I asked him once, maybe 6 months after, why he still bought the ticket. He looked at me like I'd asked him something he couldn't quite translate. Then he said he'd tell me when he figured it out himself. Clara went back to her window. The following Friday, she watched him more carefully than she had before. She watched the way his hands held his hat. Not tightly, not nervously, but with a kind of deliberateness, like holding it was something to do with hands that otherwise didn't know what to do with themselves. She watched the way his eyes moved down the platform when the train arrived. Not desperate, not delusional, just looking, quietly, steadily looking. And she thought about her father's chair, about how for 2 full months after he died, she had not been able to move it from the spot where it had always sat beside the window, because moving it felt like agreeing to something she wasn't ready to agree to yet. She understood Gideon Mercer better than she'd understood anyone in a long time. She still didn't go talk to him. Not yet. It was the rain that finally moved her. The November Friday that changed everything started badly. The stove in the station office had developed a crack in the flue, and the smoke it produced was thick enough to drive Clara out from behind the window and into the waiting room proper, where at least there was a cross-draft from the door. 3 passengers had come through in the morning, all of them complaining about the weather, 2 of them complaining about the schedule, and one of them, an older gentleman in a coat that had seen considerably better decades, complaining about the price of everything in general, which Clara took personally even though she knew she shouldn't. By the time the 11:40 was due, the rain had arrived properly. Not drizzle. Rain. The kind that came off the prairie in November with a kind of cheerless determination, like it had made a commitment and intended to see it through. Clara looked out at the platform. Gideon was already there. She didn't think about it. She went to the back room, found the tin of coffee she'd brewed an hour earlier, poured 2 cups because she was already holding the pot, and carried them outside. He heard her coming. The boards on the platform were old, and they announced every footstep, and turned. His expression was not unfriendly, but it was guarded in the way that men who have learned to keep their own company become guarded when the company is suddenly no longer optional. Coffee? Clara said. She held out the cup. He looked at it, then at her. You're the new clerk, he said. It wasn't a question. 2 months now, she said. Clara Winslow. I'd shake your hand, but I'd spill the coffee. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the possibility of one. He took the cup. Gideon Mercer. I know, she said. Small town. Hmm. She sat on the far end of the bench, not crowding him, not performing nonchalance, just sitting because her feet hurt, and the overhang was keeping most of the rain off, and she had a cup of coffee and nowhere she urgently needed to be for the next 20 minutes. They sat without talking while the rain came down and the clock above the platform moved toward 11:40. It was Clara who broke the silence. She hadn't planned what she said. She had thought, on the walk out, that she would say something practical. Something about the weather, or the delayed schedule, or the crack in the flue. Something that gave him an easy way in or an easy way out, whichever he preferred. Instead, she heard herself say, quietly, in a tone she hadn't used since before her parents got sick, "Who are you waiting for?" The question dropped into the air between them and sat there. Gideon's hands tightened slightly on the tin cup. Not much, just a fraction. The kind of movement you only catch if you're watching closely. He didn't answer right away. The rain filled the silence. In the distance, just barely audible, the sound of the 1140 beginning its approach, the low vibration the track carries before the engine itself is visible. "My wife," he said finally. Clara said nothing. "She used to come back on this train," he said, "every Friday. She'd been down in Salino with her mother most of the week, and she'd come back on the Friday, and—" He stopped, looked at the track. "She never walked the platform, said walking was too slow, so she'd run the last part of it, toward me." A pause. Laughing because she was running, like it was funny to her, that she couldn't just walk. The train was visible now, smoke against the gray sky, the sound building. "She passed," he said, 4 years ago." "I know," Clara said gently. "Ruth told me." He nodded slowly. Like he'd known Ruth would have told her eventually, like this was inevitable. "I kept coming back," he said. "I know how it looks." "It looks like you loved her," Clara said. He was quiet for a long moment. The train arrived. The noise of it filled everything for a while, the hiss of steam, the voices of passengers, the efficient chaos of arrivals and departures. They both sat still inside it. When it was quiet again, Gideon said, "I'm not waiting for her to come back. I know she's not coming back." He looked at his coffee. "It's just, this was the last place where I could still see it. Her running, clearly. The way she laughed." He shook his head slightly. "At home it gets harder to see. But here—" He didn't finish. Clara looked out at the empty track. "My father had a chair," she said, "by the window in the sitting room. After he died, I couldn't move it for 2 months. My neighbor said I should get rid of it, said it wasn't healthy." "What did you do?" "I told her to mind her own business." She paused. "Then I moved it, eventually, when I was ready." She looked at him. "I didn't get rid of it." For the first time since she'd sat down, Gideon Mercer looked at her directly. Not the polite glance of acknowledgement he'd given her when she handed him the coffee, but actually looked, the kind of looking that means a person is registering that you are real and present, and possibly someone whose words are worth the attention. "Where's the chair now?" he said. "I left it in Topeka," she said, "when I came here." A beat. "I don't know if that was ready or just running." He looked at her a moment longer, then he looked away, back at the track. "Might be both," he said. "Can be both." She nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." The platform was empty now. The train long gone. The rain still coming down, but softer now, as if it had made its point and was losing interest. Gideon stood, put on his hat, and buttoned the top button of his coat. He looked at the tin cup in his hand and seemed to become aware of it for the first time, like a man waking up slowly. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "It wasn't very good," Clara admitted. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She laughed. She hadn't expected to. The sound surprised her. It surprised him too. She could tell by the way his head turned, slightly, toward it. He handed her the cup and walked off the platform, and Clara sat where she was for another few minutes, in the rain, holding 2 empty tin cups, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that sat in the chest the way heat sits in stone after the sun has moved. She went back inside. She left the stove cracked because the flue was still broken and smoke was smoke. She sat behind her window. She looked at the cup she'd brought for herself, still half full and now cold. She drank it anyway. Outside, the November rain went on. The track was empty. The bench at the far end of the platform sat in the gray light, with its peeling paint and its initials someone had carved into the back. JT loves MK, 1879. A declaration that had survived longer than most declarations managed to survive. Clara thought about a man who stood at a grave of a memory, not because he was unable to move forward, but because he hadn't yet been given a single reason to. She thought about herself. She thought, well, same. The following Friday, she brought 2 cups of coffee again. She didn't make a speech about it. She just set one on the bench beside him when she came out, the same way you'd set a lamp on a table because the room needed a little light. He said nothing when she sat down, but he moved over, just slightly, making room. And that barely perceptible shift of a man on a bench was the first real thing that happened between them. Not the coffee. Not the conversation about the chair and the running and the laughing. That small unconscious movement, that making room, was the moment the story actually began. Neither of them knew it yet. That was the trouble with beginnings. They so rarely announced themselves. The cattle were already sick by then, though Gideon didn't know it yet either. The disease was moving through the county the way bad news moves through a community, quietly at first, arriving in rumor before it arrives in fact, and by the time the fact is undeniable, the damage is already further along than anyone wanted to admit. He would find out in 3 weeks. But on that second Friday, with the worst still ahead of him, Gideon Mercer drank his coffee on a bench in Redstone Crossing, Kansas, and for the first time in 4 years, there was someone sitting next to him when the eastbound train came in. He didn't watch the passengers as closely as he usually did. Clara noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The second Friday after their coffee conversation, Gideon arrived 7 minutes earlier than usual. Clara noticed because she had started noticing things like that. The small adjustments people make when something in their routine is shifted without them fully admitting it. He came through the door at 11:18 instead of 11:25, bought his platform ticket the same as always, exact change, no eye contact with the window, until the last second when he said thank you. And she said, "You're welcome." And there was a half beat of something that wasn't quite awkward but wasn't quite comfortable either. The way 2 people feel when they've shared something real and haven't yet decided what to do with the fact that they shared it. She had the coffee ready. She hadn't planned to make it a habit. She'd told herself the previous week was a one-time thing, bad weather, smoke from the broken flue, an impulse she'd acted on without thinking it through. But Thursday evening, she'd found herself making sure the tin was full and the stove would be working by morning, and she'd stopped pretending she wasn't doing what she was clearly doing. When she came out onto the platform with the 2 cups, Gideon was already on the bench. He looked up when he heard the boards announce her. He didn't say anything. He took the cup she held out. She sat at her end of the bench, which had quietly established itself as her end over the course of exactly 1 previous visit, and they looked at the track together while the coffee steamed in the cold December air. "Flue get fixed?" he asked. "Not yet. They're sending someone from Salina. Apparently no one in Redstone Crossing fixes flues. Bill Hatcher does. Bill Hatcher told me it was above his expertise." Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. "Bill Hatcher once told me he could fix a busted axle on a wagon. Took him 4 hours and the wheel fell off again going down Main Street." "That's extremely reassuring," Clara said. This time he actually laughed. It was a short sound, like he'd let it out before he thought to stop it, and then he looked mildly surprised at himself. Clara looked straight ahead at the track and said nothing, because she understood instinctively that drawing attention to the laugh would make it the last one for a while. They sat in silence after that, the comfortable kind that takes most people years to build and occasionally just arrives between 2 people who are, for reasons neither can fully explain, tuned to a similar frequency of quiet. The 11:40 came in 3 minutes late. 6 passengers. Gideon watched them the way he always did, that steady, careful inventory of faces. Clara watched him watch them. She had started to understand that this was not grief in its rawest form. Grief in its rawest form was what she'd felt in the first weeks after her mother died, when it ambushed her in ordinary moments, reaching for a second coffee cup out of habit, turning to say something to someone who wasn't there. What Gideon did on this bench was something past that, something that had passed through the worst of the fire and come out the other side not healed exactly, but tempered. hardened into a shape that could hold its own weight. When the platform emptied, he didn't leave right away. That was new. He turned the cup in his hands and said, without looking at her, "You said you didn't know how to build a future for yourself last week." Clara blinked. She'd said that? She thought back through the conversation, and yes, she had said something like that. She hadn't expected him to be holding on to it. "I said I'd spent so long taking care of my parents that I'd sort of misplaced the part of me that knew how to want things for herself," she said carefully. "That what you said? More or less?" He nodded slowly. "How old were you when your mother first got sick?" 25? So 6 years, give or take." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not nothing. 6 years." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." "You don't have to know what you want yet," he said. He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way practical people sometimes deliver the most useful truths. Not dressed up, just handed over. Sometimes you just have to start doing things and wait to see which ones feel like yours. Clara looked at him. He was staring at the track. He seemed almost unaware that what he'd just said was the most directly helpful thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived in Redstone Crossing. "Is that what you did?" she asked. "After Lillian?" The name sat between them for a moment. She hadn't used it before. It had been there, implied, present, but she hadn't said it out loud, and she watched to see if it landed wrong. It didn't seem to. Or if it did, he absorbed it without showing the impact. "Tried to," he said. "Ranch keeps you busy whether you want it to or not. Cattle don't wait on your grief. Fences don't care." A pause. "Some days that was the worst thing. Some days it was the only thing that kept me functional." Clara thought about that. The particular mercy of obligation, how it can feel like cruelty and salvation at the same time. "I didn't have that," she said. "When my father went, the thing that had been keeping me functional was gone. There was nothing that needed me anymore." "Station needs you now," Gideon said. "The station mostly needs someone who can read the schedule and count change." "That's not nothing either," he said. She looked at him again. "You keep saying that." "Because people keep forgetting it." She had no answer for that. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The platform was empty and the December light was thin and flat, the kind of light that doesn't so much illuminate as simply make things visible. When he left that day, he said, and she could tell by the way he said it that he'd been deciding whether to say it for some part of the last 20 minutes. "Same time next week." It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an invitation either. It was something in between, a statement of intent that left her the room to object, if she wanted to object. "I'll have the coffee ready," she said. He nodded once and walked off the platform. The December that followed was not kind to Redstone Crossing or to anyone in it. The cold arrived with a thoroughness that had people cutting firewood in shifts and worrying about water pipes in buildings that weren't supposed to have water pipes but did. The cattle in the county were already stressed from an early dry spell in November, and stressed cattle are susceptible cattle, and susceptible cattle in close quarters are one bad week away from disaster. The disaster arrived on a Wednesday. Clara heard about it the way she heard about most things in the town, through Ruth, who heard about it through the telegraph, which was how all genuine emergencies traveled. 3 ranches in the eastern part of the county had reported losses, significant losses. The disease moved fast and it moved silent at first, which was the worst combination. By the time an animal showed enough outward signs to pull it from the herd, it had already been living among healthy animals for days. She heard Gideon's ranch was among those affected before he told her himself. He didn't come on the Friday immediately following. She stood on the platform with 2 cups of coffee, and the 11:40 came and went, and he wasn't there. She told herself it didn't mean anything. A sick herd was a crisis of the first order. A man didn't leave his ranch in the middle of a crisis to sit on a bench at a train station. She still felt his absence in a way that surprised her. The bench at the far end of the platform looked different without him on it. Larger, somehow, more pointedly empty. She drank both cups of coffee herself, which she later thought was either pitiful or practical depending on how you chose to look at it. He came the following Friday, and he looked like a man who had not slept more than a few consecutive hours in 10 days. She saw it immediately. Not just the shadows under his eyes, though those were there, dark and deep, but the way he moved, with the particular economy of someone running on will rather than energy. Every gesture contained, Nothing wasted. He walked to the window, bought his ticket, said morning to her instead of nothing, and went out to the platform. She gave him 5 minutes. Then she went out with the coffee. He took the cup without looking up. "I heard," she said. "I'm sorry." He nodded. Didn't perform stoicism about it, didn't wave it off the way some men wave off things that are quietly destroying them. He just nodded, and she understood that the nod contained multitudes. "How bad?" she asked. He looked at the track. "Lost 31 head so far, quarantined the rest. Might hold, might not." A pause. 15 years of work in that herd. Not all of it, but enough of it. Is there anything that can be done? Treatment? Or, there's a veterinarian coming up from Wichita next week. Might have something. Might not. He said it flatly, not with defeat exactly, but with the realism of a man who had stopped expecting problems to have clean solutions. "Winter's the worst time for cash flow anyway. I've got reserves, but they won't last through spring if I lose another 30 head. Clara held her cup and did not offer him platitudes. She had been on the receiving end of enough well-meaning platitudes in the past year to know what they were actually worth, which was very little, which was approximately the cost of the air they were spoken into. "Your land," she said instead. "Is the land in any danger? Can the debt get to the land?" He looked at her then, slightly surprised, like he hadn't expected the question to be practical. "Not if I'm careful," he said. "Land's my own outright. Lillian's father left her some money when he passed. We used it to buy out the mortgage 8 years ago." "So you have the land no matter what?" "Yes." "Then you can rebuild," she said. "If it comes to it." He was quiet for a moment. "Takes years," he said. "I know," she said. "So did the first 15. He looked at her for a long moment. That same direct look he'd given her the first day, the one that meant he was actually paying attention. Then he looked away, back at the track, and the train arrived with its usual noise and drama, and everyone who was getting off got off. And when it was quiet again, he said, "You're a practical woman, Clara Winslow." "I've had to be," she said. "So have I," he said. That was all. But it was something. It was the particular something that happens when two people discover they speak the same underlying language. Not the surface language of pleasantry and small talk, but the deeper one. The one made of hard experience and straightforward honesty and the willingness to look at bad news without blinking first. January came. The veterinarian from Wichita arrived, examined the quarantined animals, and prescribed a treatment that was expensive, difficult to administer, and offered no guarantees. Gideon paid for it without complaint because complaint was not a luxury he could afford. He told Clara about it the following Friday, piece by piece, the way you tell things to someone you've started to trust. Not in one organized confession, but in fragments, accumulated over the cold weeks, handed over a little at a time, like a man slowly unpacking a bag he's been carrying too long. She learned that the ranch was called the Double M, which had stood for Mercer and Mercer until there was only one Mercer left, and he hadn't changed the name because changing it had felt like agreeing to something. She learned that Lillian had kept a kitchen garden behind the house, herbs mostly, things she grew for cooking, and that the garden had overwintered badly the year after she died because no one knew exactly how she'd tended it, but that somehow parts of it survived, and that Gideon still kept it going after a fashion, not because he was a man who paid particular attention to herbs, but because he couldn't bring himself to let the last living things she'd planted die off entirely. Clara said nothing when he told her that. She just listened. She learned that he had a younger brother in Missouri who wrote occasionally and visited never, and that this was fine with both of them, in the way that estranged family relationships are sometimes genuinely fine and sometimes only described as fine because the alternative requires more emotional energy than either party has available. She learned that he'd taught himself to cook after Lillian died out of pure necessity, and that he was adequate at it, but not enthusiastic, and that he sometimes ate the same meal 4 nights in a row simply because making a decision about dinner felt like a complicated use of limited cognitive resources. In return. And this was the thing that genuinely surprised her, that she found herself doing it without planning to. She told him things. She told him about her mother's last year, how the illness had changed her mother's personality in ways that were frightening and then heartbreaking, and then, toward the end, simply exhausting in the specific way that loving someone who is disappearing from themselves is exhausting. She told him she felt guilty about the exhaustion. He said that was natural. She said she knew it was natural, but that knowing didn't make the guilt smaller. He said no, it usually doesn't. She told him she'd been engaged once, briefly, to a man in Topeka named Warren, and that Warren had been perfectly decent, but that when her mother's illness became serious, Warren had gradually become less present. Not cruel, not dramatic about it, just less present, and eventually not present at all. And that she had been more relieved than heartbroken, which said something about how suited they'd been to begin with. "Did you love him?" Gideon asked. He asked it the way he asked most things, directly, without apology, but also without demand. Like he wanted to know, but understood she didn't owe him the answer. "I think I love the idea of a life with someone," Clara said. "Which isn't really the same thing." He considered this. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." "Did you and Lillian always—" She stopped, reformulated. "Was it always easy, between you two?" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Lord, no. First 2 years we spent more time being annoyed at each other than anything else. She had opinions about how the ranch should run. I had opinions about her opinions." A pause. "We figured it out, but it took time, and some fairly loud evenings in the kitchen." Clara smiled. "What did she win?" He raised an eyebrow. "The arguments," she said. "Who won them?" "She did," he said. "Mostly." "And the ranch?" "The ranch is better for it," he said quietly. She was right about most of it. February arrived with a cold snap that cracked the water pump handle on the station platform and kept Clara busy with maintenance complaints for the better part of a week. The cattle at the Double M were holding. Not thriving. The disease had taken too much for thriving, but holding. Gideon reported this on the first Friday in February with the particular understated relief of a man who has learned not to celebrate too early, who knows that good news in a fragile situation is provisional until proven otherwise. "The vet thinks the quarantine held," he said. "The animals that survived the first wave seem to have something. Whatever they've got, the ones that are left seem to have it." "Immunity?" Claire said. "Something like it." He wouldn't commit to the word. A pause. "Man from Wichita doesn't commit to much." Sensible of him. Infuriating of him. She laughed. He smiled. These were different from the early weeks. These were relaxed, the kind of exchange that comes from two people who have spent enough time together that they have each other's rhythm. And then February did something unexpected. It gave them a warm week. Not spring warm. This was Kansas in winter. Warm was relative. But warm enough that the snow along the creek banks pulled back, and the sky on 2 consecutive days was a clear, uncomplicated blue. And on the Friday of that warm week, after the train had gone and the platform was empty, Gideon didn't leave right away, and Clara didn't pretend she needed to get back inside. And somehow they ended up walking along the south side of the station, following the fence line toward the creek, still talking. She couldn't afterward have said exactly what they talked about on that walk. It was the kind of conversation that covers a great deal of ground without being about any single thing. She remembered saying something about the creek and whether it flooded in spring, and him saying it did, every 3rd year like clockwork, and her saying, "How did you know which was the 3rd year?" and him saying, "You looked at the water level in March and you got a feeling." And she remembered laughing at that, getting a feeling, and him saying, "Look, cattle ranching is not an exact science," and her saying clearly, given the flu situation and Bill Hatcher's name being prominently on the county contractors list. She remembered, walking back to the station, that at some point during the walk their pace had naturally matched. Not because either of them arranged it, just because it happened, the way it happens when two people are comfortable enough together that their bodies take cues from each other without being told to. She noticed it. She didn't say anything, but she noticed it with a clarity that remained with her for the rest of that day and into the evening, when she sat in her small room above the station and tried to read and found she wasn't reading, found she was sitting with the book open to the same page she'd been on for 40 minutes, thinking about the way a man's stride slows when he's talking about something that matters to him, and the way you don't realize you've slowed down to match it until you're already walking in step. She told herself it was just friendship. She had moved to a new town. She was lonely in the specific way that loneliness in new places operates. Not the dramatic kind, but the low-grade persistent kind, the kind that makes you cherish any genuine human warmth you find. Of course she valued these Fridays. Of course she'd started looking forward to them. The telling herself it was just friendship did not entirely work, which was information she filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly. March came wet and cold and full of mud, the way Kansas spring always came. Not a gentle arrival, but a grudging one, winter releasing its hold with bad grace, the ground turning to muck before it turned to anything useful. The double M was holding. Gideon had lost a total of 38 head by final count, which was devastating financially, but not catastrophically so. Not yet. The remaining herd was stable. The land was still his. He'd made arrangements with a bank in Salina that he told Clara about in the matter-of-fact way he told her most things now, not because he needed advice, but because he'd gotten used to saying things out loud on Friday mornings, and finding that saying them out loud made them more manageable. She understood. She did the same thing with him. "The terms aren't good," he said, about the bank arrangement. "They never are, when you're the one in need. But it gives me the season. If the herd does what I think it'll do, I'll make the first payment in August and the rest by winter." "And if it doesn't?" He looked at her. "Then I'll have a harder problem in August." She nodded, "But not an impossible one." "No," he agreed, "not impossible." She'd started doing this, and not offering false comfort, but finding the structural truth in a situation and naming it clearly. He had noticed. She could tell by the small way his shoulders settled when she did it, the way a person settles when someone says the thing they were afraid to hope was true, but suspected might be. It was on the second Friday in March that Ruth Alcott appeared on the platform for the first time ever during Gideon's visit. Ruth had absolutely no professional reason to be on the platform at 11:40 on a Friday morning. This fact was not lost on either Clara or Gideon, and Ruth, whose social awareness had never been her defining quality, seemed cheerfully unconcerned with the transparency of what she was doing. She found a reason to be there for the full duration of the 11:40's arrival. She made conversation with 3 passengers. She checked something on the notice board that had not changed in 6 weeks. She greeted Gideon by name in the particular warm tone that suggests the greeter is pleased to find 2 people together and wants them to know she's noticed. When she went back inside, Clara sat very still for a moment. "Your telegraph operator," Gideon said, "is not subtle." "No," Clara said. "She really isn't." He looked at the track. "You mind?" he said. The question was careful, deliberate. Clara thought about that. She thought about what it meant that he'd asked it, not letting the subject float past, not pretending he hadn't noticed what Ruth was implying. He'd caught it, and he'd held it there and asked her directly how she felt about it. "No," she said. "I don't mind." A pause. "Good," he said. And that was all that was said. But the thing that had been growing quietly in the space between 2 people on a bench, unnamed, untouched, given no language by either of them, shifted slightly in the light of those 4 words and became not declared but acknowledged, not stated, but no longer entirely hidden. The bench at the far end of the platform held 2 people on March Fridays now, and the coffee was always ready when he arrived, and the mornings were getting longer, and somewhere on the double M, the herb garden that Lillian had planted was doing what gardens do in March, quietly, stubbornly, against all reasonable expectation, beginning again. Neither of them knew about the letter yet, the one that would arrive for Clara in April on official railway stationery, with a formal offer and a salary she couldn't pretend wasn't significant, and a city she'd never been to, and a start date that felt, when she read it, both very far away and terrifyingly close. But that was April. This was March. And March was still giving them Fridays, and Fridays were still giving them the bench. And the bench was giving them, hour by quiet hour, the particular fragile and unnameable gift of 2 people who have each been alone long enough to understand what it means to no longer be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which meant Clara had 4 days to decide what to do about it before Friday. She read it twice at the window during a slow stretch of the morning, when the only sound in the station was the clock on the wall and the distant complaint of a crow somewhere out past the stock pens. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, which was where she kept things she needed to think about, but wasn't ready to look at again yet. The offer was from the Central Kansas Railway's regional office in Abilene, a head clerk position at the Abilene station, Bigger, busier, more important in the network by every measurable standard. The salary was 40% higher than what she made in Redstone Crossing. The position came with private accommodation, not the single room above the station she currently occupied, where the walls were thin enough that she could hear the wind argue with the eaves on cold nights. It was, by every reasonable metric, an advancement, the kind of thing you applied for, the kind of thing that, if you'd asked Clara Winslow 6 months ago whether she'd want it, she'd have said yes without hesitation. She didn't say yes without hesitation now. That was the problem. She told no one. Not Ruth, which required active effort because Ruth had the particular gift of appearing whenever you were keeping something and asking how things were going in a tone that made withholding feel vaguely criminal. Not any of the other station staff. Not in any of the 3 letters she wrote that week to people she'd known in Topeka who still occasionally expected correspondence. And not Gideon. She told herself she needed to think it through first on her own. That was reasonable. That was how adults handled decisions. You didn't go to the person most affected by a decision before you'd decided anything, because then you were using them to do your deciding for you, which was a particular kind of unfairness she had no interest in committing. That was what she told herself. What she actually felt, sitting with the letter folded in her coat pocket through Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, was something closer to the way she'd felt standing in her parents' house in Topeka after the second funeral. The horrible clarity of realizing that a door was open, and that walking through it would mean leaving something behind, and that she wasn't certain she knew anymore which side of the door she was supposed to be on. She had not expected to become uncertain. She had come to Redstone Crossing as a temporary measure, a practical solution to an immediate problem. She had not come here to build a life. She had come here to survive long enough to figure out what a life might look like. And somewhere between November and March, between 2 tin cups of bad coffee and a broken flu and a cattle disease, and a man who remembered his wife by coming to the only place where he could still clearly see her. Somewhere in all of that, Redstone Crossing had stopped feeling like a temporary measure. That was the thing she hadn't counted on. That was the thing sitting in her chest on Thursday evening while she tried, again, to read a book and couldn't manage it. Friday morning came gray and mild, the particular mild of early April that felt like a negotiation rather than a commitment, the weather making no promises. Clara was behind the window when Gideon came in at 11:18, same as he had been since December, 7 minutes early, exact change, 1 platform ticket. She had the coffee ready. She went out and sat on the bench and handed him his cup, and for the first 10 minutes they talked about the herd. 2 of the cows had calved in the last week, both calves healthy, which was the kind of news that functioned as genuine relief in the context of the winter they'd just come through. Gideon reported it with the measured satisfaction of a man who had learned not to let himself feel too good about anything until it had demonstrated it intended to stay. Both strong? Clara asked. One stronger than the other. The smaller one's eating, though. That's the main thing. What'd you name them? He gave her a look. I don't name calves. Why not? Because then you get attached and then you have a problem in the fall. You don't name any of them? I name the horses, he said, with the particular dignity of a man who has thought about this distinction and is comfortable with where he's drawn the line. Clara smiled into her coffee cup. That's an interesting place to put the line. Horses remember their names, he said. Cattle don't. How do you know the cattle don't? He looked at her. I've been ranching for 20 years. That's not actually an answer. It is absolutely an answer, he said. She laughed. He shook his head, but she could see the corner of his mouth moving in the direction of a smile before he looked away. These exchanges had become one of the quiet textures of her weeks, the particular pleasure of a conversation with someone who pushed back, who matched her, who didn't perform agreement because he thought she wanted it. The letter stayed in her coat pocket. The 11:40 arrived. 5 passengers. Gideon watched them with the same stillness he always brought to it, that steady inventory of faces. Clara had noticed over the weeks that it took him less time now to settle afterward. In November, it had been a full minute of recollection before the quiet returned. Now it was quicker. Not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone, and she hadn't decided how she felt about that. But shorter. Like a door that used to stick swinging more freely on its hinges. When the platform was empty, he didn't speak right away. He turned his cup in his hands. She waited. Got a letter from the bank in Salina this week, he said. They've revised the terms. Her attention sharpened. Better or worse? Worse. Interest went up. Something about the regional market, the man said. A lot of ranches in trouble after the disease went through and the bank adjusting accordingly. He paused. Which means I need a stronger season than I'd planned on. The August payment is going to be harder. She thought through what she knew of his situation, the pieces he'd handed her over the months, assembled now into a reasonably complete picture. The calves help, she said. Some, not enough on their own. What would be enough? He told her. The number was specific, and it was difficult, but not, she thought, unreachable. Not if the spring and summer went reasonably well. She said that. He neither agreed nor disagreed, which she had come to understand meant he thought she was probably right, but wasn't going to commit to optimism out loud because he didn't trust optimism to behave itself. She very nearly told him about the letter then. The words assembled themselves somewhere in the neighborhood of her collarbone, and she felt the shape of them, the weight of them. And she thought, now, say it now. She didn't say it. She told herself there would be a better moment. She had until the end of April to respond to the offer. There was time. The better moment did not arrive that Friday. He left when the platform began filling with the pre-departure crowd for the 12:15, and Clara went back inside and stood behind her window and processed tickets for 20 minutes, and tried not to think about the fact that she was in possession of information she had not shared with the person it most concerned, and that this was beginning to feel less like careful deliberation and more like something she was ashamed of. April moved forward the way it does, with small urgencies, with weather that couldn't make up its mind, with the particular quality of light that appears in the middle of that month in Kansas and makes even ugly things look as though they might yet come to something. The second Friday of April, Ruth materialized on the platform again during the 11:40. Clara had given up feeling exasperated about this. Ruth was who she was. And to be fair to Ruth, what she was also a woman who had been watching two lonely people sit on a bench for 5 months and had apparently decided that her presence was a form of social encouragement, which was misguided but not unkind. Gideon, Ruth said, arriving at the bench with the comfortable authority of a woman who has known a town long enough to feel proprietary about it. I heard your calves are doing well. 2 of them, Gideon said. Both named, Ruth said, and gave Clara a look. He doesn't name calves, Clara said. He named the gray mare Eleanor, Ruth said. Eleanor is a horse, Gideon said. It's different. Why is it? Ruth began. Because horses remember their names, Gideon and Clara said, at the same time, in the same flat tone. Ruth looked between them. A slow, satisfied expression arranged itself on her face. The expression of a woman watching something she had predicted arrive precisely on schedule. She found a reason to return to the telegraph office approximately 90 seconds later. When she was gone, Gideon looked at his coffee cup. We've had that conversation before, he said. Apparently, Clara said. We have opinions about it. He looked at her sideways. She looked at the track. Something passed between them in that exchange. Not named, not grabbed at, but present. The accumulation of months in a single sideways look, the kind of thing that only means something when it's built on a foundation of all the other things. She made the decision that night. Not about the offer, about telling him. She would tell him next Friday. She owed him that much. Not to make the decision for him, not to ask him to make it for her, but to tell him the truth, while there was still time for the truth to matter. She had been given an offer. She was considering it. She hadn't decided yet. Those were the facts. He deserved the facts. She wrote her response to the railway office that same evening. Not an acceptance, not a refusal, but a request for a 2-week extension on their deadline. They replied by telegraph on Monday. Extension granted, decision required by May 1st. She had been so focused on the decision itself that she almost missed what happened on the Thursday before the Friday she'd planned to tell him. She was behind the window when a man came in she didn't recognize. Not unusual in itself, Redstone Crossing saw travelers moving through on the main line every week. But this man didn't buy a ticket to anywhere. He asked for the station manager, and when Clara told him she was the senior clerk and the manager was in Salina until Friday, he said he'd wait. He waited 3 hours. Clara brought him coffee, 1 cup, not 2, which felt significant in a way she chose not to examine, and he was polite but closed, the way men are when they're conducting business that doesn't concern the people around them. When the station manager, a competent but unimaginative man named Dorsey, came back from Selena at 4 in the afternoon. The two of them went into the back office and spoke for 40 minutes with the door closed. When they came out, the stranger was gone, and Dorsey had the look of a man who had received information that would require him to make announcements he didn't enjoy making. He came to Clara's window. "Regional is doing a review," he said, "of staffing across small stations. The line through Redstone Crossing is down 19% in traffic from 2 years ago. They're looking at whether positions can be consolidated." Clara looked at him. "It doesn't mean anything is changing," Dorsey said, in the tone of a man who means it might very well mean something is changing. "Just wanted you to know there's a review." She went back to work. She processed the last 3 tickets of the day. She locked the window at 6 o'clock and went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the particular timing with which life occasionally delivers its complications. Not spread out conveniently, but stacked, arriving together like freight on a single platform. She now had a decision to make that was larger than she'd understood it to be on Tuesday. The offer in Abilene had looked like a choice between ambition and belonging. It now potentially looked like something else, the chance to leave before she was asked to. She did not sleep well that Thursday night. Friday morning came cold for April, a reminder from the weather that spring was still a conditional arrangement. Clara was at the window when Gideon came in. She watched him cross to the counter. The same unhurried walk, the same deliberateness that she'd first read as detachment and now understood as simply the way a man moved when he was comfortable in his own skin. He counted out his change. He said morning. She said morning back. She went to the back room. She poured the coffee. She went out to the platform and sat on the bench and gave him his cup, and for a while they talked about nothing urgent. He mentioned that the smaller of the 2 calves had started following the older one around like a shadow, which he said with the measured neutrality of a man who was not getting attached and wanted that clearly understood. She said that sounded like attachment. He said it was not. She said, "What would you call it then?" He said management. She said of a calf. He said of a situation. She laughed. He looked at the track, but she could see he was fighting the same losing battle with the corner of his mouth that he always fought when she caught him being funny. And then the 11:40 arrived, and the 5 minutes of its arrival passed, and the platform was empty again, and Gideon had settled back into his stillness, and Clara looked at her coffee cup and knew she was out of time. "I got a letter," she said, 3 weeks ago." He didn't respond immediately. He waited, the way he did when he understood that a sentence was a door and he was being invited to see what was on the other side. "From the railway office in Abilene," she said. "They've offered me a position, head clerk at the Abilene station." The silence that followed was not long, maybe 4 seconds, but it was a specific kind of silence, the kind that has weight, the kind that changes the air pressure slightly. 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "You didn't say anything." "No. I wanted to think it through first." He looked at the track. She couldn't read him fully. She was better at it than she'd been in November, but he still had reserves she hadn't fully mapped, places he kept his own counsel that she'd learned not to push at. "Have you?" he said. "Thought it through?" "I've been trying to," she said. "There's also—" She stopped, made herself continue. "There's a review. Regional review of staffing at smaller stations. Dorsey told me yesterday. Traffic on this line is down. I don't know what it means yet. Might mean nothing." He turned his head and looked at her. She held his gaze. "Might mean your position here becomes—" He stopped. "Uncertain," she said. "Yes." He looked away. She watched the line of his jaw, the small muscle there doing something, thinking or holding back, or both. "When do you have to decide?" he said. "May 1st. He nodded slowly, turned his cup in his hands. The platform was quiet. The April wind moved through the gap between the station wall and the storage shed with a low sound that wasn't quite a whistle. "Is it a good offer?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's a genuinely good offer." He nodded again. "What do you want to do?" She almost answered immediately. She caught herself, because the answer that rose to the surface was not the one she'd expected to have. It wasn't the careful, practical, self-interested answer she'd been practicing for 3 weeks. It was simpler and more frightening than that, and she wasn't ready to say it out loud, and she didn't say it. "I don't know yet," she said, which was a lie by omission, and she was not proud of it, But she was also not ready to say the true thing, because saying the true thing required a courage she hadn't yet managed to locate. What she was not ready to say was, I don't want to go. I don't want to leave this station and this town and these Friday mornings and this bench and the person sitting next to me on it. I came here to survive, and instead, I am beginning to feel like myself again for the first time in years. And I am terrified to admit that, because the last time I built something that felt like mine, it was a life organized around people who weren't going to last. And I don't know how to trust that something good won't disappear before I've finished being grateful for it. She didn't say any of that. She said, I don't know yet. He accepted this. He didn't press. He sat with her in the quiet that followed and finished his coffee and watched the empty track. And if he was doing any kind of emotional arithmetic on the inside, he did it invisibly, which was his particular form of dignity, and also occasionally his particular form of cruelty, unintentional as it was. When he stood to leave, he paused. He held his hat in his hands and looked at the bench, and not at her, at the bench itself, and said quietly, Whatever you decide, I want it to be because it's right for you, not because of anything else. She looked up at him. Gideon, I mean it, he said. Not dismissive, not noble in the performed way, just direct, the way he was always direct. You've built something here, that's real, but so is Abilene, and he paused. I'm not going to be the reason someone doesn't take a real opportunity. She said nothing. She looked at his face, at the weathered honesty of it, at the effort it cost him to say that, at the faint shadow under his eyes that had been there since the cattle winter and hadn't entirely cleared. He put his hat on and walked off the platform. She sat where she was for a long time after he left. Longer than usual. Long enough that the 12:15 pre-departure crowd began to filter onto the platform, and one of them, a woman with 2 children who had the permanent harried expression of someone managing more than she should have to manage alone, asked if the bench was taken. No, Clara said. It's not taken. She stood up and went back inside. She worked the rest of the afternoon in the same mechanical way you work when your mind is somewhere else entirely, processing tickets, answering questions, noting the schedule changes on the board, performing the job with her hands while her head was occupied with the particular internal argument that doesn't resolve itself, the one between what is sensible and what is true. The offer was real. The salary was real. The security was real. If the staffing review went badly, having the Abilene position settled before the axe fell would be the smartest move she could have made. And Gideon was real. The bench was real. The Friday mornings were real, and the way they'd changed the quality of her weeks, and the way she thought about his voice when she was falling asleep, and the way he'd moved over on the bench the second week to make room, and the way that small motion still felt 5 months later, like one of the most significant things anyone had ever done for her. All of it was real. The question was which real she intended to live in. She locked the window at 6. She went upstairs. She took the letter from Abilene out of her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it so long it had gone soft at the folds, and she put it on the small table by the window. She looked at it. Outside, Redstone Crossing was doing what it always did at this hour, quieting down, lamps going on behind windows, the last of the day's business closing up. The particular small-town version of evening that she had come to recognize as something she loved without ever deciding to love it. She picked up the letter. She put it down again. She went to bed without deciding anything, and she lay in the dark and listened to the wind argue with the eaves, and somewhere down the line a freight train passed through without stopping, and the sound of it moved through the night like a question being asked of no one in particular and answered by nobody at all. May 1st was 2 weeks away. She was not any closer to ready. She was beginning to suspect that ready was not the state she was going to arrive at, that she was going to have to make this decision in the absence of ready, the way most real decisions were made, in the gap between knowing what you should want and knowing what you actually want, with no guarantee that the distance between them would close before the deadline arrived. What she didn't know, couldn't know, because he had said it to himself and to no one else, standing at the fence line of the Double M on Friday evening watching the last of the light leave the sky, was that Gideon Mercer was in the process of making a decision of his own. He had told her he wanted her to choose what was right for her. He had meant it. He still meant it. But he had also, in the weeks since March, in the accumulated weight of Friday mornings and creekside walks and tin cups and exchanges that made him laugh in the unguarded way he hadn't laughed in years, He had also, quietly, with the reluctance of a man who had learned the hard way what it cost to love someone and lose them, arrived at the knowledge that he was not a neutral party in this decision. He was not ready to say that either. 2 weeks. May 1st. The deadline sitting on both of them like a weight neither had agreed to carry, and both were carrying anyway. The herb garden behind the double M was coming back. It did this every spring, which still surprised him every year. The way the ground gave back what you thought it had taken permanently. The sage was up first, then the thyme, then something he didn't know the name of that Lillian had planted, and that he'd been too afraid to pull up in case she'd told him once and he'd forgotten. He'd never learned to cook with any of it. He just kept it alive. He stood at the fence in the April evening and looked at the small garden and thought about a woman sitting on a bench 2 miles away, holding a letter that had the power to take her somewhere she might flourish. And he thought about what it meant that after 4 years of Friday mornings, the one thing that now made him stay on the platform past the departure of the 11:40 was not a memory. It was a person. He didn't go back inside for a long time. The stars came out over the Kansas plain, vast and indifferent and magnificent in the way only vast, indifferent things manage to be magnificent. The cattle moved in the dark. The herb garden held its ground. May 1st was 2 weeks away, and Gideon Mercer had not yet decided whether he was a man who had found his way back to something, or a man who was about to watch it leave on the eastbound train without ever having said the one true thing he'd been failing to say since March. He had not decided. But the failing to decide was becoming, in its own quiet way, a kind of answer. The week between the 3rd and 4th Friday of April was the longest week Clara had experienced since the week her father died. That was not a comparison she made lightly. It was simply the most accurate thing she could say about those 7 days. The way time moved through them, with the particular reluctance of time that carries something unresolved. The way each morning arrived with the weight of the decision still sitting exactly where she'd left it the night before. Patient, waiting. She had written the letter to Abilene accepting the extension. She had not written the letter accepting the position. She had not written the letter declining it either. The deadline sat on the calendar like a stone. May 1st, now 10 days away, now 9, now 8. And every morning she woke up and thought, today I will decide, and every evening she went to bed having decided nothing. She was not a woman who struggled with decisions. That was what made this particular paralysis so unfamiliar and so quietly maddening. She had decided to leave Topeka. She had decided to take the Redstone Crossing position. She had decided to walk onto a rain-soaked platform and ask a man a question that was none of her business. She made decisions the way practical people make decisions, with the available information, without excessive sentiment, and then she lived with the consequences without spending too much time second-guessing herself. But this decision had a variable in it that she didn't know how to calculate, and the variable was sitting on a bench every Friday morning and had told her, with the particular painful decency of a man who refused to be selfish, even when being selfish might have been easier for both of them, that he wanted her to choose what was right for her, as though she could separate what was right for her from the question of what she was leaving behind. The Thursday before the 4th Friday, she did something she hadn't done in months. She took the afternoon off. Dorsey was back from wherever Dorsey periodically went, and the schedule was light, and she walked. Not the purposeful walking she did between the station and the post office and the dry goods store and back again, but the aimless kind, the kind that had no destination, that went where it went and let the mind do what it needed to do without the interference of efficiency. She walked out past the south edge of town, where the road turned to trail and the trail turned to open grassland, and she walked in the April afternoon with the wind at her back and the sky doing something complicated overhead, involving 3 different kinds of cloud and a quality of light that made the grass look almost gold. She thought about her mother, about the particular quality of love that had been required in those last years, the kind that asked everything of you and gave back very little in practical terms, the kind that was not about reciprocity but about fidelity. She had given it. She did not regret giving it. But it had cost her something she was still in the process of understanding. She thought about Warren, decent Warren, inadequate Warren, the man who had loved her in the good weather and found reasons to be elsewhere when the weather changed. She had not been heartbroken. She had been confirmed in something she'd already suspected, that the people who said they would stay and then didn't were not failures of character so much as failures of imagination. They couldn't envision who they'd need to be when things got hard. And so when things got hard, They discovered they weren't that person, and they left. She thought about Gideon, who had not left, who had stayed on a bench for 4 years, not because he was unable to move, but because he understood that some things were worth staying for, even when staying cost something. She had walked nearly 2 miles before she realized she was walking in the direction of the double M. She stopped. She stood in the middle of the trail with the grass bending in the wind on either side, and she looked at the track ahead of her and understood with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable that she had not come out here to think. She had come out here to arrive somewhere she'd already decided to go and let herself be surprised when she got there. She turned around and walked back to town. She sat in her room that evening and wrote 2 letters. She wrote them both out fully, the acceptance to Abilene and the refusal, because she had read somewhere once that writing both sides of a decision made the right one clearer, and she had nothing to lose by trying. She read them both. She sat with them both. She thought about the bench, about the second Friday when he'd moved over to make room, about the way he'd said, "Same time next week," not asking, not commanding, just stating what was going to happen, the way you state things when you trust that the other person will show up. She thought about the herb garden she'd never seen, but knew in her mind as clearly as if she'd walked through it. The sage coming up first, the thyme behind it, the unnamed thing in the corner that he kept alive because he didn't know its name and was afraid he might have been told once and forgotten. She folded both letters and put them in her coat pocket, one on each side. She still didn't know. The Friday came. It came the way important days tend to come, without announcement, without any special quality of light to distinguish it from any other April morning. Clara was at the window at 9 o'clock. The stove was working properly now. Bill Hatcher had managed the flue repair with only minor incidents, and the smoke smell was finally gone from the waiting room. Small mercies. She watched the door. At 11:18, Gideon walked in. He looked better than he had in weeks. Not well exactly, that was still too strong a word for a man who'd been through the kind of winter he'd been through, but less hollowed out. There was something more present about him today. She couldn't have said what it was, specifically, just that he was more there, somehow, than he'd been in the fraught weeks of February and March. He bought his ticket. He said, "Morning." She said morning back. He went to the platform. She poured the coffee and went out. They sat. The April wind was doing its usual work on the loose boards at the far end of the platform, creating a sporadic creak that Dorsey had been promising to fix since February. The sky was white and high, the kind of overcast that wasn't threatening but wasn't promising anything either. They talked first about nothing urgent. He mentioned that Eleanor, the horse, had developed an opinion about her morning feeding schedule that could only be described as demanding. Clara said that seemed like a personality trait that ought to have been caught earlier. He said he'd caught it fine, he'd just lost the argument. She said, "You seem to lose a lot of arguments." He said he won the ones that mattered. She said, "Like which ones?" He said, "Like which ones to take seriously." She held her coffee cup and looked at him and thought, "I don't want to leave you." She thought it very clearly, without flinching from it, without softening it. Then she looked at the track. "May 1st is a week away," she said. The shift in his posture was small, almost nothing, but she was watching and she caught it. "I know," he said. "Have you—" She stopped. "I haven't decided yet. I want you to know that. I'm not telling you I've decided. All right? But I've been thinking about something you said, that you wanted me to choose what was right for me." She paused. "I appreciate that. I do. But I think it's incomplete, as a thing to say." He turned his head and looked at her. "Because what's right for me involves things I can't fully evaluate alone," she said. "And I think you know that. And I think you said what you said because you didn't want to be the reason I stayed if I shouldn't stay, which is decent. It is. But it also—" She looked at him steadily. "It leaves me making a decision without all the available information." He was quiet for a moment. The loose board at the end of the platform creaked. "What information do you need?" he said. She held his gaze. "I need to know what these Fridays are to you," she said. "Not what they were. What they are." It was the most direct she'd been. She felt the exposure of it, the particular vulnerability of asking a question you can't take back, that exists now in the air between two people and has to be answered somehow, one way or another. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the track. He breathed. She waited. You know what this bench was? He said slowly. When you got here. Yes. It was a place where I could still see something I'd lost. That's what it was. He paused. You asked me that first day and I told you the truth. I came back because this was the last place where I could see her clearly. I remember. What I didn't tell you, he said, was that I wasn't sure what it would mean when that started changing, when it started being less clear, over the winter. He stopped. His hands were still on the cup. I used to come here and the first thing I'd see in my head, standing on this platform, was Lillian running, every time, as clear as standing in front of someone. He paused. That's not what I see first now. The quiet stretched. Clara waited. He looked at her. I see coffee, he said, 2 cups, and you walking out that door. She felt the words land. She felt them move through her the way cold water moves when you're overheated, the specific relief of something arriving at the right moment in the right form. She didn't speak right away. She let it be there, what he'd said, and she didn't rush to cover it with words. That's not nothing, she said finally. She said it the way he'd said it to her in December, about the station needing her, quietly, returning his own language to him. He recognized it. She could see that he did. No, he said. It's not nothing. The 11:40 arrived. They both turned toward it with the easy familiarity of people who have done this particular thing many times together, and the passengers came down the platform, and Gideon did his quiet inventory, and then it was over, and the train left, and the platform was theirs again. Neither of them had moved. The staffing review, Gideon said. Did you hear more about it? Dorsey says the decision will come from regional in the next 2 weeks. He thinks it'll probably be a reduction in hours rather than a full elimination, but probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence. So you might not have a position here regardless. Possibly. He nodded. She could see him working through it, not making her decision for her, just understanding the actual structure of what she was facing. He did this with problems the way he did it with everything, practically, without wasted motion. The Abilene position, he said. You'd be good at it. I know. Better pay. More security. Yes. You'd build something real there. Maybe, she said. I'm building something real here too. He looked at her. That's the part that's hard to weigh, she said. Abilene is knowable. I can see exactly what it offers. What I have here is... She looked at the bench, at the track, at the sky. Harder to put a number on. They sat in the quiet that followed, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of 2 people who had said the real things and were now sitting with them, which is a different quality of silence than any other. It was Gideon who broke it, and what he said was not what she expected. Come see the ranch, he said. She looked at him. Not... He stopped. Said it plainly. I'm not asking you to make any decisions. I think you've been deciding about a place you've never seen, and there's a garden there that I've been keeping alive for 4 years without fully knowing why. And I think... He paused. I think you should see it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was the most he had asked of her in 5 months. He was not a man who asked easily, and she knew that, and she knew what it cost him to ask this. Sunday, she said. Sunday's fine, he said. He left at his usual time. She stood on the platform after he'd gone and looked at the track and thought, this is a door opening. She thought, I am either walking through it or I'm about to understand that I can't. She went back inside. She pulled both letters from her coat pocket. She held the acceptance in her left hand and the refusal in her right. Then she put them both back and told herself to wait until after Sunday. Sunday was a clear morning, the kind of April Sunday that redeems all the gray Aprils that came before it. Clara borrowed a horse from the livery, a reliable bay named, somewhat optimistically, Champion, and rode the 2 miles to the Double M on roads that were soft but not muddy, the sun coming at the perfect low angle that made everything look more significant than it probably was. The ranch was not what she'd pictured, and also exactly what she'd pictured. The house was a working house, not large, not new, with a porch that needed paint and a window on the north side that had a crack in the frame someone had patched with what appeared to be candle wax and hope. The barn was in better condition than the house, which said something accurate about Gideon's priorities. I was at the fence when she rode in, working on a post that had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle and needed resetting. He looked up when he heard the horse, straightened, and nodded in the way that served as his version of a formal greeting. "You found it," he said. "It's 2 miles on a straight road," she said. "Some people have trouble with simple directions." "I'm not some people." He almost smiled. "No," he said, "you're not." He tied Champion to the fence post and walked her around to the back of the house. And that was where she saw the kitchen for the first time, through the door that opened from the side porch. A kitchen that was clean and functional and organized with a particular kind of care that spoke not of a man who was naturally organized, but of a man who had learned, out of fidelity rather than preference, to maintain things to a standard set by someone else. The pots were hung in the same order on every hook. The shelves were arranged in a system that had clearly been designed by a person who thought more carefully about kitchens than Gideon Mercer probably thought about anything other than cattle. She didn't say anything about the kitchen, but she noticed it, and he knew she noticed it, and there was an understanding between them that didn't require words. The garden was behind the house, south-facing, in a spot that got the afternoon light. It was modest in scale, maybe 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, bordered by stones that someone had placed with care. Not just thrown down to mark a line, but actually considered, sized to fit together. The sage was up, dense and gray-green, smelling sharply of itself in the morning air. The thyme was coming in beside it, still low. And in the corner, the thing without a name, sprawling, dark-leafed, with small purple flowers that had opened in the last week, apparently. Clara crouched down beside it and looked at the flowers. "Do you know what it is now?" she asked. "No," Gideon said. He was standing behind her, slightly to the left. "I looked through a seed catalog one winter. Couldn't find it." She touched one of the small leaves. "It's oregano," she said. "It flowers purple in the spring." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have known," he said. "She probably mentioned it," Clara said gently. There are things you're not in a position to hear until later." She heard him breathe. She stood up and turned. He was looking at the garden with an expression that was complex in the way that grief and gratitude are always complex when they arrive together. Not one or the other, but both at once, sharing the same face, making room for each other. "She was good at this," he said, quietly. "At making things grow." "I can see that," Clara said. "It's still growing." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not new exactly, but more visible than it had been. A wanting, not desperate, not grasping, but clear. The kind of wanting that has been honest with itself. "I'm not asking you to be her," he said. "I want to say that plainly. I know that might seem like something that needs saying, and maybe it doesn't, but I want you to hear me say it." "I hear you," Clara said. "What's here is, it's still here. Her things, her kitchen, her garden. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I wouldn't want you to," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You mean that?" "Yes," she said. "I mean it. Gideon, what she left here is part of why this place feels like something real. You kept things. You didn't erase anything. That's—" She paused. "That's not something to apologize for. That's something to honor." He looked at the garden for a moment, then at her. "Stay," he said. It was one word. He said it without preamble, without the hedging that men sometimes do when they're afraid of the answer. He said it plainly, the way you say something when you've been not saying it for long enough that the weight of the not saying has become heavier than the word itself. "Not for me," he added. "Stay because you've built something here. Because you have Fridays that matter, and a bench that's half yours now, and a town that's—" He stopped, tried again. "Stay? Because this is yours. If you want it." Clara looked at him, at the lines of his face in the April morning light, the particular landscape of a man who had been through serious weather and come out the other side, not unscathed but intact, at the garden behind him and the cracked window frame and the barn in better shape than the house. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, the Abilene offer, the clean future it represented, the sensible choice, the advancement. She thought about what he'd said on the platform. "The first thing I see now is coffee and you walking out that door." She thought about her father's chair, about how she'd moved it when she was ready and not before, and how even then she hadn't gotten rid of it, and how that had been the right call. "I'm not deciding today," she said. He nodded. He'd expected that. She could see it. "But I want you to know—" She stopped, found the words. I want you to know that what I'm deciding between is real. Both sides of it. Not just the practical side. Both sides. She looked at him. You understand what I'm telling you? Yes, he said. I understand. She stayed for another hour. He showed her the herd, the remaining animals, the two calves, including the smaller one who did, she noticed immediately, follow the larger one with a devotion that was transparently not management, and they walked the fence line on the south side of the property where the land rolled gently toward the creek, and the grass was coming in thick and green, the best it had looked since before the dry November. They didn't talk about the decision again. They talked about the fence and the creek and a stand of cottonwoods at the far southern boundary and what the summer might bring if the weather cooperated, and whether cooperating weather was something you could count on in Kansas, which they agreed it was not, which was not a reason not to hope for it. When she rode back to town in the afternoon, Clara held the reins loose and let Champion find his own pace on the road, and she thought about what it felt like to be somewhere that knew her. Not just to be somewhere that was familiar, but to be somewhere where she had become, gradually and without fully noticing, a person who was expected and waited for and valued. She thought about how rarely that happened in a life. She thought about how easily you could mistake it for something ordinary because it arrived quietly, in the form of coffee and a bench and a man who moved over to make room. She put Champion back at the livery. She walked to the station. She went up to her room. She took both letters out of her coat pockets. She read them one more time each. Then she took the acceptance letter and set it on the table, and she folded the refusal and held it, and she sat at the window looking out at the empty platform and the track going east toward Abilene and a dozen other places, and she breathed. She hadn't decided yet. That was still true. But the weight of the letters in her hands was no longer equal, and she knew it, and she thought that the knowing was probably what deciding actually felt like most of the time. Not a thunderclap, but a settling. A quiet arrival at a place you'd been moving toward for longer than you realized. The bench at the far end of the platform sat empty in the Sunday afternoon light. She looked at it from the window for a long time. It did not look empty the way it had looked in November, before she understood what it meant. It looked empty the way a place looks when the person who belongs there has simply stepped away for a while and is expected back. May 1st was 6 days away, and Clara Winslow sat at her window with a letter in her hand and the other one on the table. And outside the April light moved across the platform, and the track ran east into a distance that was real and possible and good. And she held what she held, and she breathed, and she waited to see which things she could not put down. The following Thursday, Dorsey called her into his office. He sat across his desk from her with the expression of a man who is about to say something he considers his duty to say and is not enjoying the duty. Regional came back, he said, on the staffing review. She looked at him. They're cutting the second clerk position, he said. Effective June 1st. The station volume doesn't support 2 full-time clerks. We'll go to 1 full-time and 1 part-time. He paused. You're senior, so you keep the full-time. She blinked. Then I'm fine. You're fine, he confirmed. It's young Davis who takes the reduction. She sat with that for a moment. The threat she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, the one that had complicated the already complicated calculus of the Abilene decision, was not what she'd thought it was. She was not in danger of losing her position. She had never been in danger of losing her position. She had made this decision, or failed to make it, partly on the basis of an uncertainty that turned out to be no uncertainty at all. She walked out of Dorsey's office and stood in the middle of the waiting room and thought, well. Then she thought, it doesn't change anything. It changes the terms, but not the substance. Abilene was real before the staffing review existed, and it was real after it was resolved, and Redstone Crossing was real before and after also, and the question was still the same question it had always been. She went behind her window. She worked the rest of the afternoon. She did not sleep particularly well that Thursday night. She lay in the dark and thought about what she knew, which was this. There was a position in Abilene that would advance her career and pay her more and give her more security and expand her world. And there was a bench in Redstone Crossing where a man had been coming for 4 years, and where she had been coming for 5 months, and where something had been built between them that didn't have a name yet but was real in the way that only accumulated time can make something real. She thought about what she wanted, not what she should want, not what was sensible, what she actually, genuinely wanted at 31 years old, with a year of grief behind her and a life in front of her that was still mostly unmapped. The answer, when she finally let herself have it, was simple. It was not elegant. It was not a revelation. It was just true and quiet, and it had been true for a while, and she had been walking around it for weeks the way you walk around the piece of furniture you've decided to move but haven't moved yet. She wanted the bench, she wanted the 2 cups of coffee, and the creaking board, and the 1140, and the man who had moved over to make room. She wanted the herb garden, and the horse named Eleanor, and the kitchen organized by someone else's system that he'd kept running out of love. She wanted Redstone Crossing, which was not a famous place or a grand place, but was her place now, in the way that places become yours, not when you arrive, but when you decide to stay. She reached out in the dark and put her hand on the folded letter on her bedside table. Tomorrow was Friday. She would tell him. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Kansas night was immense and quiet and indifferent and beautiful, and somewhere 2 miles down the road, a ranch was doing what ranches do in the dark, simply going on, which was its own kind of faithfulness, the kind that didn't announce itself but was always there when the morning came. She woke up Friday morning knowing what she was going to do, and the knowing did not feel like triumph. It felt like the moment after you've set down something heavy. Not joy exactly, but the particular relief of a body that has been carrying weight long enough to forget what not carrying feels like. She dressed. She went downstairs. She made the coffee. The refusal letter to Abilene was in her coat pocket. She had written it out clean the night before, folded it, sealed it. It would go to the post office after her shift. That was the plan. Do the thing first, mail the letter after. Don't leave yourself a window to reverse course in the middle of the doing. She was behind the window at 9 o'clock. The morning was ordinary in every measurable way. Thin clouds, moderate wind, a freight through at 10 that didn't stop, 2 passengers buying tickets to Salina on the noon departure. Davis, whose hours had just been cut, was in the back room doing inventory with the slightly martyred air of a young man who felt the universe had not yet properly recognized his potential. Clara left him to it. At 11:14, 4 minutes earlier than usual, the door opened and Gideon walked in. She noticed the 4 minutes. She noticed also that he was not wearing his work coat. He was wearing the dark wool coat she had only seen once before, in January, when he'd ridden in from a meeting at the bank in Salina. It was not a dress coat, but it was a deliberate coat. A coat that said, "I made a decision about what I was wearing today." She felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise exactly, something more like recognition. He came to the window. He counted out his change, exact, same as always, and said, "1 platform ticket." She took the money. She printed the ticket. She held it out, and when he took it, their fingers did not touch, which was the same as every other Friday, which somehow today felt like a thing worth noting. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He went to the platform. She went to the back room, poured the coffee, and stood for a moment holding both cups and breathing. She thought, "This is just a Friday." She thought, "This is not just a Friday." She went out. I was on the bench. She sat at her end, the designation so established now it required no thought, and gave him his cup and looked at the track and said nothing for a while, because the morning was doing that thing mornings occasionally do where they feel like they have their own opinion about the pace of things, and this one seemed to want a moment of quiet before anything happened. "I talked to Dorsey yesterday," she said. Gideon held his cup, waited. "The staffing review. It came back. I keep my position, full time. It was never actually in question. It was the second clerk position they were looking at, not mine." She paused. "I'd been making this decision partly based on something that turned out not to be real." He was quiet for a moment. "Does that change it?" he said. "No," she said. "That's what I realized last night. It doesn't change it. I thought it might make things clearer, and it did, just not the way I expected. It made me realize I already knew what I wanted, and I'd been using the uncertainty as cover, so I didn't have to just say the thing plainly." He looked at her. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the folded envelope. She held it where he could see it. "This is a letter declining the position in Abilene," she said. "It goes to the post office after my shift today." He looked at the envelope, then at her. His expression was careful, not guarded, not closed, but careful, the way it was when he was taking something seriously enough not to react to it prematurely. "Clara," he said. "Let me say it," she said. "I've been not saying it for long enough." She looked at the track. "I came to Redstone Crossing because I had nowhere else to go. That was the truth. I was empty and I was lost, and I needed somewhere to be while I figured out who I was without the people I'd spent 6 years caring for. She paused. I didn't plan to find anything here. I wasn't looking. I wasn't in any condition to be looking. She felt him listening. The specific quality of his attention, the way he gave it completely, without fidgeting, without interpolating, was one of the things she had come to rely on without fully acknowledging she was relying on it. But I found it anyway, she said. Or it found me. I'm not entirely sure which. She turned and looked at him directly. I don't want to go to Abilene. I don't want more money or a bigger station or a fresh start somewhere. I don't know anyone. I want the bench. I want the bad coffee that I make and then complain about to myself. I want Friday mornings and a man who loses arguments to his horse and keeps an oregano plant alive for 4 years without knowing what it is. She stopped. I want to stay. The silence that followed was not long, but it was real and it was his, and she let him have it. He set his coffee cup down on the bench beside him. He looked at the track for a moment. That particular look, the one she'd watched for months, that meant he was locating himself, making sure of where he was before he moved. Then he turned to her. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. This bench? He said. 4 years I came here and there was one thing I was doing. You know what it was. He paused. And then you walked out with a cup of coffee in the rain and asked me a question nobody else had bothered to ask. And something shifted. Not right away. Not dramatically. Just, he looked down at his hands. Slowly. The way things actually shift when they're real. She held very still. I have been... He stopped. Started again, more carefully. I have been afraid, he said, that wanting you to stay was the same thing as asking you to give up something real for something I couldn't promise would be worth it. Because I don't know how to promise things like that. After Lillian, I don't... He paused. I stopped making promises about the future. The future turned out to be less negotiable than I thought. I know, she said quietly, but I also know that I have been on this bench every Friday for 4 years, and for the first 3 of them, the thing that made me come back was what I'd lost. And for the last 5 months, he looked at her. It's been you, that's just true. I come back because of you. And if you left, I would still buy the platform ticket, and I would still sit here, and it would be the same loss in a different shape, and I would survive it, because I've survived things. He paused. But I don't want to survive it. I'm done surviving. I want... He stopped. What do you want? She said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the garden on Sunday, clear and direct and without the performance of certainty, which was what made it real. I want you to stay because you want to stay, he said. And I want to give you something worth staying for. I don't know if I know how anymore. I've been alone long enough that I've probably developed some habits that'll be not ideal. Gideon, she said, I'm serious. I eat the same dinner 4 nights in a row. I know, she said. You told me in January. That's going to be... It's a real issue. I can cook, she said. He blinked. I know you can cook. Then we have a solution to the dinner problem. He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened on his face. Not the partial, reluctant, almost smile she'd been collecting for 5 months, but an actual smile, full and unguarded. The kind that changes the whole architecture of a face, and she understood immediately that she had not seen it before, not like this, and that she had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting. That's... Yes, he said. That does solve the dinner problem. I'm very practical, she said. You really are, he said. They sat with that for a moment, and it was the warmest silence she could remember sitting in, which was information about how far they'd come from the rain and the first cup of bad coffee and the question she'd asked because she couldn't leave it unasked. The 11:40 arrived. They both turned toward it. The train pulled in with its usual noise and self-importance, the steam and the voices, and the organized disorder of people getting off and other people waiting to get on. The passengers came down the platform. 7 today, a good number for a Friday in late April. Gideon looked at them. Clara watched him look at them. She watched the familiar process, the quiet inventory, the steady attention, and she watched what happened when the last passenger came through the gate and moved away into town. He turned back from the track more quickly than she had ever seen him turn. Not abruptly, just without the long settling, as though the place he was returning his attention to was more interesting than the empty platform. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about it. But they both knew. The train departed. The platform cleared. The May air was clean and cool, and the cottonwoods down by the creek were coming in with their first leaves. That particular yellow-green that only lasts about 10 days before they go full green, the brief and honest color of things that are just beginning. "Come to dinner Sunday," Gideon said. "I'll cook." "You'll cook the same thing you had on Wednesday and Thursday." "I haven't decided that yet." "But probably." "Probably," he admitted. "But it's not bad. The thing I make." "What is it?" "Beef stew." "In April?" "Beef stew is not seasonal," he said, with the dignity of a man defending a position he knows is only partially defensible. "It is a little bit seasonal," she said. "It's a year-round food." "Gideon." "I'll make something else," he said. "I'll figure something out." "I'll bring bread," she said. "You don't have to bring anything." "I'm bringing bread," she said. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Bring bread." She went back to work after that. The noon passengers, the afternoon tickets, the end-of-day accounting that needed doing before she could leave. She moved through the afternoon with the particular lightness of a person who has set down something heavy and discovered that the world on the other side of it looks essentially the same but feels different. The way rooms feel different when you've rearranged the furniture. Same walls, same light, different entirely. She mailed the letter to Abilene on her way back from the station. She stood at the post office counter and held it for one extra second, not reconsidering, just honoring the honesty of what it meant to close a door, and then she let it go. Walking back to the station, she passed Ruth Alcott coming out of the telegraph office with the expression of a woman who has been watching developments and is deeply satisfied with how they've developed. "Nice afternoon," Ruth said. "Very nice," Clara agreed. Ruth's expression intensified. "Anything you want to share with the community?" "Ruth," Clara said, "I'm just making conversation." "You are not just making conversation." Ruth smiled without any guilt at all. "Gideon Mercer is a good man," she said. "He's been a long time getting back to himself. Some people never do." She paused. "Whatever you did, I'm glad you did it." Clara looked at her. "I just brought coffee," she said. "Honey," Ruth said, "sometimes that's the whole thing." She walked on. Clara watched her go and thought, she's not wrong. The whole elaborate machinery of what had happened between her and Gideon over 5 months, the conversations and the confessions and the cattle disease and the bank letters and the Abilene offer and the Sunday in the garden and all of it, it had started with nothing more than a cup of coffee and a question asked because it needed to be asked. That was the thing about courage. It didn't have to be large. It just had to happen. Sunday dinner was not beef stew. It was a roasted chicken that was slightly overdone on one side, served with potatoes that were correctly done, and green beans that he had clearly started too late and were crisper than intended. Clara ate all of it. She brought the bread, which was from the bakery because she had not had time to make bread from scratch, which she admitted to immediately, and he said store-bought bread was bread, which was the correct attitude. They ate at the kitchen table, Lillian's kitchen, with the organized shelves and the hung pots. And it was not uncomfortable, which was the thing Clara had wondered about. She had wondered if being in this kitchen, so clearly shaped by another woman's hands and mind and preferences, would feel like trespassing. It did not. It felt like being inside something that had been built with care and was still standing, which was not the same as being excluded from it. She belonged to the present of this kitchen, and Lillian belonged to its history, and those were not competing claims. They were just different rooms in the same house. She helped wash up after. They stood at the basin, him washing and her drying, and they talked about the herd. The smaller calf was thriving now, had put on weight in the last 2 weeks, which Gideon reported with his characteristic understatement, and about the fence on the south side that needed proper repair before summer, and about whether the creek was going to flood this year, which he said was a third-year year. And she said, "How do you know?" And he said he'd checked the water level in March and got a feeling. "A feeling," she said. "A ranching feeling," he said. "That's still not a method." "It's absolutely a method." "Gideon, I genuinely want to understand the epistemology of the ranching feeling." He stopped washing and looked at her. "The what?" How you know what you know from the feeling." He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He took the dish back from her and dried it himself, slowly, thinking. "You look at the water," he said finally, And you think about the last 3 years. And your body knows before your head does whether this is a third year. She looked at him. That is either profound or nonsense. Could be both, he said. Can be both. She recognized those words. He'd said them to her the first day, on the platform, about her leaving Topeka. Whether it was ready or just running, can be both. She set her dish towel down and looked at him across the kitchen, at the man he was, imperfect, guarded in the places where he'd been hurt, funny in the deadpan way that required you to be paying attention to catch it, faithful in a way that went all the way down, the kind of faithfulness you couldn't perform because it was too slow and too quiet to be a performance. It was just what he was. "What are we doing?" she said. Not anxious, just asking, naming the thing they hadn't named. He set down the pan he was washing. He turned. He looked at her with the directness that was his most consistent quality, the thing that had been present from the very first conversation and had never wavered. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, if that's what you want. I'm aware I'm not." He paused. "I'm not young, and I come with a history that's visible. Literally, you can walk around this kitchen and see it." "So can I," she said. "Mine's just in Topeka and you can't see it." "I know it's there," he said. "I don't need to see it." She nodded. "Then yes," she said. "Court me properly." "Right," he said. He seemed momentarily uncertain, which was new and not unpleasant to observe. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Neither am I," she said. "We'll figure it out. Probably make a few mistakes. Almost certainly. I'll try not to eat the same dinner 4 nights in a row." "I appreciate that effort," she said. "I'm not holding you to it." He almost smiled. Then he did smile. Not the full one from Friday, but real, present, his. "Sunday dinner," he said. "Every week. If that works." "It works," she said. She rode back to town in the late afternoon, and the Kansas sky was doing what it did in May, when it felt like being generous, vast and layered, the kind of sunset that's too big for any individual response and just has to be absorbed. Champion moved at an easy walk. Clara held the reins loose and let the evening happen around her and thought about the word properly and how much she liked it. Properly. Like something worth doing carefully, like something worth taking the time for. The months that followed were not effortless. Nothing real is effortless. There was an evening in June when they had the first genuine argument about the bank payment and whether Gideon should take on a second loan to expand the herd faster or rebuild slowly over 2 seasons. And Clara had a clear opinion and stated it clearly, and he had a different opinion and stated it clearly, and they were both right in different ways and wrong in others. And it took most of the evening and some of the following morning to work through it to the place where they could hear each other again. He went home that night without the argument resolved. She sat in her room above the station and thought, "This is hard," and then thought, "Yes, that's how you know it's real." He came back Wednesday with the numbers worked out more carefully than before, and he'd moved his position in the direction of hers, and she'd had time to see the holes in her own thinking and moved in the direction of his, and the thing they arrived at together was better than either of them had arrived at separately, which was, she thought, perhaps the point. There was a Sunday in July when Eleanor the horse was sick, and Gideon spent most of it at the stable, and Clara helped without being asked, without making it into something significant, just being there because being there was what the situation called for. Eleanor recovered. Clara didn't say anything afterward about having stayed. Neither did he. But she caught him, once, looking at her across the kitchen table that evening with an expression she recognized from a Sunday in April, in a garden, standing next to a plant neither of them could name until she named it. He was learning her the way she was learning him, not all at once, not neatly, but thoroughly. The August bank payment was made. Not easily. It required the kind of careful management that kept Gideon awake on more than one Tuesday night. But it was made, on time, in full. Clara was at the station when he rode in after the bank visit, and he stopped at the window and said simply, "Done." She said, "Good." He nodded. She could see the weight leaving his shoulders. Not gone. The next payment was in November, and that was its own calculation. But gone for now, the specific weight of this specific thing, and watching it lift off him was one of the better things she'd seen in some time. September brought the beginning of something she hadn't anticipated. Redstone Crossing began to feel, in the specific way that places feel when you have become part of their texture, like a place that also belonged to her. Not the town she'd arrived in out of necessity, not the temporary measure, not the gap between grief and the future. Hers. The particular ownership that comes not from property or paper, but from time and presence, and the accumulated small acts of showing up. She knew people's names, and they knew hers. She knew which counter at the dry goods store had the loose leg, and which window at the station stuck after rain. She knew that Ruth Alcott took her coffee without sugar but would accept a little if you offered it with enough insistence, and that Bill Hatcher's flue repair work should never be left uninspected, and that the creek really did flood in the third year, which Gideon had known from a feeling and which turned out to be correct, though the flood was modest by most standards. She knew the double M. She knew the kitchen, and the herb garden, and Eleanor's demanding opinions about breakfast timing. She knew the particular quality of light in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and the sound the porch boards made in different temperatures, and which fence posts had been replaced, and which ones had been standing since before Gideon bought the land. She knew the bench at the end of the platform, the one with J.T. Love's M.K., 1879 carved into the back, the letters deepened now by decades of weather, but still legible, still there, still declaring something that had outlasted both the people who'd made it. And she knew Gideon. She was still learning him, which was different from knowing, but she knew him in the ways that counted. His silences and what they meant, his humor and how it arrived sideways when he trusted you enough to let it, his capacity for loyalty, which was enormous and quiet and shaped everything he did without announcing itself, his grief, which was still present, but had become something he carried differently now. Not a stone in his chest, but more like something woven into him, part of him. Not something to be fixed or removed, but something he'd learned to live around the way you live around the changed landscape after a flood. She loved him. She had known it since April, possibly before, and had spent several months being careful with the knowledge the way you're careful with anything that can break. She had not said it yet. He had not said it yet. There was no urgency about the saying. They had time, they had Sunday dinners and Friday mornings, and a ranch that was slowly coming back, and a town that had absorbed them both into its fabric, and the saying would happen when it happened, on its own schedule, because the best things usually did. October arrived, and with it the particular quality of Kansas autumn that Clara had discovered she loved more than any other season. The way the light went golden and slanted, the way the grass turned, the way the air had a clarity in it that made everything look a little more precise, a little more definite, like the world was making up its mind about what it was. On the third Friday of October, Gideon arrived at the station at his usual time and bought his ticket and went to the platform. Clara made the coffee. She came outside. He was not sitting on the bench. He was standing at the end of the platform, at the point where the track curved away toward the east, with something in his hands. She came closer and saw that it was a small bundle of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the creek banks in summer and were mostly gone now, dried out, the last of the season. He must have gathered them earlier in the week and kept them, though what he'd kept them for she hadn't known. She stood beside him. He looked at the track. She watched his face. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it here, because here is where it matters." She waited. "I spent 4 years on this platform holding on to something I thought I had to hold on to," he said, "because if I let go of it, I thought I'd lose her again, the clear version of her, the one I could still see." He turned the flowers in his hands. "What I didn't understand was that you don't actually lose people by living. You carry them differently. They go somewhere, inside you, in the things they built, in the gardens they planted. They don't disappear. They just change form." He looked at her. "Lillian would have liked you," he said. "I'm certain of that. She had opinions about everything, and she would have had opinions about you, and most of them would have been right." Clara felt something move in her throat. She held it. "I'm not letting go of her," he said. "I'm not going to. But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life standing at the end of a platform looking east." He looked down at the flowers. "She deserves better than that. And so do I. And so do you." He crouched down and laid the wildflowers on the edge of the platform, at the point where the boards ended and the track began. He stayed crouched for a moment. Clara didn't say anything. Some moments aren't hers to fill, and she understood that. He stood. He turned to her. "I love you," he said. "I don't know when it started exactly. I know it was before I thought it was." She looked at him. at this man who had been waiting at a station for years, not because he was broken, but because he was faithful, and who had stayed faithful even when faithfulness meant sitting alone on a bench in the rain, who had moved over to make room for someone without being asked to, who had kept an herb garden alive without knowing one of the plants by name, who had told her to choose what was right for her, even when what was right for her might have been to leave, because he respected her enough to mean it. "I love you," she said. "I've known since Sunday in the garden. When you said you weren't asking me to be her." He looked at her. "That's the moment," she said. "When I knew." He nodded slowly, like he was filing it, like it was important to have the exact location of it. The 11:40 arrived. They both turned toward it side by side and watched the train pull in with all its usual noise and disruption and self-importance. The passengers came off. 9 today, a good number. They moved past in their ordinary way, people with ordinary purposes, going about the business of their lives. Gideon looked at them. Clara watched him look. And then he turned away from the track. Not reluctantly, not with effort, just easily, naturally, the way you turn away from something you've finished. And he looked at her. The 11:40 departed. "Coffee's going cold," she said. "I know," he said. They walked back to the bench together. She picked up the cups, both still warm enough, and handed him his. They sat at their ends, which were maybe slightly less their separate ends than they used to be. The platform was quiet. The October light came at its golden angle across the boards. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The bench held them both, the way it always had. The old wood with its carved initials and its peeling paint and its years of people coming and going, all those arrivals and departures, all that leaving and staying, the whole long ordinary human story of people trying to find each other and sometimes, against reasonable odds, managing to do it. The people of Redstone Crossing would talk about the two of them, the way small towns talk about things they've watched develop over time, with the proprietary warmth of an audience that sat through the whole show and feels entitled to its opinion. Ruth Alcott would say she'd known from the moment Clara walked out with the second cup of coffee, which was probably true. Bill Hatcher would say he'd always thought Gideon needed company, which was less observant than he made it sound. Dorsey would say nothing, because Dorsey was Dorsey, but he would give Clara the following Friday afternoon off without being asked, and she would understand that as his version of a wedding gift delivered 9 months early. They married in November, quietly, in the town hall on a Saturday morning when the first snow of the season was coming down light and dry. Ruth cried. Gideon's brother sent a letter he probably wrote in 10 minutes that arrived 3 days late and said he was glad for them, which was something, even if it wasn't everything. Eleanor the horse was in good health. The 2 calves, still unnamed as a point of principle, were in excellent condition. The herb garden was dormant but would be back in March because it always was. The bench at the end of the platform acquired, over the winter, a small quality of change. Nothing dramatic. It was still the bench with the peeling paint and the carved initials. But the people of Redstone Crossing stopped associating it with a lonely vigil and started associating it with something else. Something harder to name, but easier to recognize. 2 cups of coffee in the rain, and a question asked because it needed asking, and the long, imperfect, real work of 2 people choosing, every Friday, to show up. Which is all it ever was, which turned out to be everything. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't stand in the middle of a room and make a speech. It shows up at a window and buys a ticket with exact change. It walks out in the rain with a second cup of coffee. It asks a question that has been living in its chest for 3 weeks, knowing the answer might be too large to carry and deciding to ask anyway. Most people are waiting for the moment to feel right before they act. But the moment doesn't feel right until you act, and by then it has been the right moment for longer than you knew. Clara Winslow asked the question. Gideon Mercer answered it. Everything else was just showing up.